Hello and welcome back to The Pisky Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. Hope everyone's well. It's lovely to be back. Apologies that there's been a bit of a break since the last episode. It's been a crazy busy few weeks with the recent talks. And on that note, I have to say thank you to everyone that came along to the recent talks in St Austell, the Castle in Bude, Liskeard Library, Borderlands Festival in Launceston, and the Maritime Museum in Falmouth. It's been great to see so many of you there, and it's always really nice to chat and meet people afterwards who have a shared passion for Cornish folklore and local history as well. If you'd like to come along to one of the live events, my talk exploring dark tales of Cornish smuggling will be coming to Trelisic Garden on the 14th of October. Then the following day, the 15th, I'll be at Cornwall Museum and Art Gallery in Truro in the afternoon, and that evening I'll be at the Polly in Falmouth. Then on the 22nd, you can catch me at the Acorn in Penzance, then the Methodist Hall in Tywardreath on the 23rd, and finally on the 24th of October at Bodmin. You can find links to tickets and more details about those events in the show notes below this episode. That's it for news, so let's get cracking with the episode. I've been looking forward to putting this one together for a while, as it's a subject that I find particularly fascinating, not least because one of the stories that we're going to be talking about later in the episode centres around my hometown of St Blaise. It's quite a well-known theme in the world of folklore, and I'm talking here about black dogs and spectral hounds. Some of you may well be familiar with famous stories and examples such as Black Shuck or the Barguest up in Yorkshire, or perhaps even the Hound of the Baskervilles. For this topic, I knew that I wanted to discuss this theme with someone who knows much more about the subject than I do, and has looked at it in much more detail. And so recently I sat down for a chat with Mark Norman, a Devon-based folklore researcher and author, and host of the Folklore Podcast. Back in 2015, Mark put together a fantastic book called Black Dog Folklore, which I highly recommend, and the book explores the subject in a lot of detail. In this episode, then, you're going to be hearing from my conversation with Mark as we discuss the theme of black dog folklore and chat about some examples from here in Devon and Cornwall. At the outset, I should say that in the episode, there's mentions of a few accounts that include some graphic descriptions and injury detail, so just a heads up there. So then, without further ado, here's our next episode, Black Dogs and Spectral Hounds. I sprang to my feet, my inert hand grasping my pistol, my mind paralysed by the dreadful shape which had sprung out upon us from the shadows of the fog. A hound it was, an enormous coal-black hound, but not such a hound as mortal eyes have ever seen. Fire burst from its open mouth. Its eyes glowed with a smouldering glare. Its muzzle and hackles and dewlap were outlined in flickering flame. Never in the delirious dream of a disordered brain could anything more savage, more appalling, more hellish be conceived than that dark form and savage face which broke upon us out of the wall of fog. A little quote there from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles, which conjures up some pretty dramatic images there with the description of the hound itself. Across Britain, we encounter folklore and stories surrounding ghostly black dogs. As the sort of kid who grew up reading books on the paranormal and the unexplained, I remember encountering an illustration of a ghostly black dog with huge glowing eyes, known as Black Shuck, that was said to haunt cliffs and fens and churchyards around East Anglia. And that image always stuck with me. Here in Cornwall, we get examples too. Some of you might remember a little while back I put together an episode exploring the story of Dando and his dogs from over at Port Eliot in southeast Cornwall. So we get stories of the wild hunt. But there's also stories of solitary ghost dogs. Writer Barbara Spooner mentions a local ghost dog in East Cornwall that was known as Darley, and it was said to haunt the area between Darley Ford and Battens in North Hill. Sometimes he's seen in human form, as a fine figure of a man carrying a log of wood on his back, but most often he's seen as a dog. Apparently, a man named Vincent Darley died back in 1764, and after that, the dog began appearing, walking the same route that Darley had regularly walked during his lifetime. I found an article in Old Cornwall that gives us an account of an apparent encounter with Darley. We're told that back in the year 1817, a woman called Catherine Buckingham, referred to as Cattern in the article, was outside her cottage, which was not far from the old carriage drive that led to a place called Battens, that was said to have been in a state of decay at this time. It seems that she and her male companion were, and I quote, sitting comfortably on a seat near the porch of the cottage one night, when who should come along to them in the dark but Vincent Darley, in the shape of a big black dog. Cattern's man hurled a broom at him. Very promptly the dog swelled up, so big as a yearling, then vanished in a ball of fire. And such thunder crashed round, and such lightning illuminated the night, that the two clung to each other, too scared to move. Yet there was neither thunder nor lightning in North Hill Churchtown. A pretty dramatic scene there, taking us back to the early 19th century in the area around North Hill. I wanted to know a bit more about black dog folklore in general, and also to look at some other case examples from across the southwest. And I thought, who better to chat with than Mark Norman? A few years ago I read his book Black Dog Folklore, and I was keen to ask him a bit more about the topic. So recently we sat down for a chat, and I began by asking Mark what initially drew him to the topic.
But I was intrigued. How did you kind of first get, what attracted you to the topic, really? What kind of drew you to the topic of black dogs and sort of spectral hounds, if you like?
Well, as with a lot of subjects in folklore, by happening across it when looking for something else, to be fair. So I was, more years ago than I care to remember now, looking at local ghost stories from Devon in particular. And as part of that, I accessed the collection of Theo Brown's notes, which are held at the University of Exeter in the Heritage Collections department in the library there. And I was really looking for just general ghost stories at that time. And this was before her collection was properly catalogued and properly stored as it is now. This was some years ago. And whilst I was in there looking for these things, I came across an old blue metal ammunition tin, which it turned out contained a lot of her notes. She was notorious for keeping her notes in crisp packet boxes and all sorts of different things, which is how they had been handed to the university when they went over to her, and they hadn't been put into archive boxes at this point. And there was this large blue metal ammunition tin that was just labelled Black Dog That was all it said on it. So, and it was going through those notes that I realized just how much material on spectral black dogs Theo had collected. I mean, she was one of the key collectors in the mid 20th century in the UK, along with a couple of others, but particularly for the Southwest, obviously, as she was based down here. And there were a lot of notes, there's a lot of personal correspondence, eyewitness accounts, and the more you delved into this, the more fascinating it became, because there were accounts that she was given after she gave talks at WI groups and towns women's guilds. And then there was correspondence from kind of quite well-known and prolific writers and people like that. So people like T.C. Lethbridge had written to her about stories, and she was corresponding with people like Ruth Tongue, who was collecting in Somerset, and Ethel Rudkin, who was collecting in Lincolnshire. And the more I went through it, the more I thought this is really far more interesting than what I was thinking I was going to look for. And we didn't really know what to do with a lot of this material. So I catalogued quite a lot of it over a period of time for the university. But within this box of notes were three different versions of draft copies of a manuscript for a book that Theo was kind of working on. People badgered her all the time to write a book on this subject, and she never did. She wrote an article for the Folklore Society journal Folklore in 1958, which is quite a definitive article. And she wrote in a couple of other places, but she never wrote the book. And people badgered her all the time, and she was never happy with it. So we tracked down her literary executor at the time, who was another well-known folklorist, Hilda Ellis Davidson, also long since deceased now. And we corresponded and spoke with her, and she gave permission for this book to be reworked and to try and seek publication for it, which was what I then set out to do. And there was a lot of work to be done. The language was very old-fashioned. It was written 1950s, 60s, 70s. Obviously, it was not up to date, because at the point at which Theo stopped collecting and writing, she suffered a stroke in the 1990s. Obviously, the collection had stopped at that point. And it kind of grew from there and became what ultimately was my book on this subject. That's how I came across it, purely by accident.
And had you kind of grown up hearing stories and things around that type of folklore, around sort of ghost dogs and black dogs and things like that anyway, before this point?
Yeah, absolutely. Because being born and bred in Devon, it's a key part of southwestern folklore. I mean, it is all over the country, but down here there are certain aspects of it which are very well known. The connections to the Wild Hunt on Dartmoor and kind of the Devil's Dogs in that way. The whole backstory of the inspiration for Hound of the Baskervilles, which again comes out of this area, which is most people's introduction to the topic, I think, really. So I was well aware of it from there, and in fact, I'd back in the early 1990s, written and produced a video, as it was back then, the days before DVDs, a video called North Devon Ghosts and Hauntings, and it looked at a number of ghost stories from around the county, and black dogs as a motif featured in that script as well. So I knew about it before that time, yeah.
In terms of the sort of the black dog and the idea of ghost dogs, is it a fairly universal phenomenon, or is it that we're quite fascinated by this in Britain?
It's definitely worldwide. So it is a universal phenomena or a universal motif, depending on how you look at it. But what's most interesting about the UK is that we have the widest variety of stories, I think. So we have these kinds of mythological links to the Wild Hunt and things like that. And then we have concepts of the black dog as we see it in the north of England as being demonic, as being a hellhound. So the Shuck and the Barguest and these sorts of things. And then we have the very protective elements of black dog stories, which you find in other parts of the country. Lincolnshire, where Ethel Rudkin was collecting. It's quite common. And then you get really kind of neutral versions that are just apparitions of black dogs, and a lot of the Devon and Cornwall variety kind of come under that category, where they're not malicious, but they're not particularly protective. They just are. So we see very common elements with other countries and the way that these things are described. One of the most interesting elements of stories relating to black dogs, for me at least, is this kind of recurring theme that you get where people use the same descriptive terms for what they're seeing or what they're experiencing. So you have the things like, having saucer-like eyes, sort of particularly big eyes and things like that. And then you see those parallels in other countries. So the Cadejo, which is like a Latin American version of the black dog, you see these very similar descriptions, but they're culturally different. So they're described over there as having eyes like tortillas, because obviously this is a very common theme from the food of that area. Whereas here, eyes like dinner plates or eyes like saucers are very common. But the meaning is exactly the same. It's just a cultural shift in the way that it's described. So there are certainly very significant patterns that you find all over the place. But closer to home, we have a really good variety of different stories, which is what makes them particularly interesting in this country, I think.
And that's something I was going to ask, is that do you find that there are you get sort of accounts that have very similar descriptions that are quite regionalized in terms of the way that these apparitions are described? Because I can think of reading of examples where you've got, and I can't remember if it's black shuck or a similar type that's got one eye in the center of the head, for example.
Yes.
And that, to me, seems quite peculiar. But do you get weird little sort of localized variations when it comes to the descriptions?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a good example. And yes, that relates to the shuck in some cases where it has one eye in the middle of its forehead. And some others, you get very rare examples where you have dogs with horns and things like that. So you get these kind of descriptive elements, and the behavioural patterns as well are very regional. So the shuck and the barghest in the north of England, as I say, the kind of demonic examples, very much centred around that area. But what's really interesting is, aside from just those kinds of regional variations that you get, and that often terminology is very regional, is you have quite distinct and quite hard borders between them. So in places like East Anglia, for example, where you get the shuck coming down into that area, or the northern parts, you find the adjoining counties where the dog is more protective. There's this very hard border where in that county they behave like that, and in that county they behave like that. And there isn't this kind of sort of mingling bit in the middle where they gradually transition between them. It's a very hard border. So there's a lot of regional sort of input, I think, into those descriptions. Yeah.
That's fascinating, because it makes you wonder why there's become such a hard difference. And you'd expect that with maybe, the transition of storytelling traditions, that there might be this sort of blend in the middle where you go, well, that sounds like a bit like that story there from there. It makes you wonder how those have developed over time. But does that kind of correspond then with the different sort of purposes that these apparitions are said to have? Because I think from remembering reading, I was one of those kids that grew up reading all the books about, the unknown and all those sort of Usborne books. And I always associated the idea of black dogs and spectral hounds with sort of being an ill omen. But I'm guessing that's one purpose that they are said to kind of fulfill, if you like.
Yes, it is. And they kind of fall into the category of fetches and things like that in that sense, where you get dogs that are associated with particular families in the same way as you get other motifs which are associated with families where they are this precursor of ill fortune or precursor of death. So they have this portentous quality about them. So down here in the southwest, obviously, the white bird of the Oxenhams is a prime example of this kind of animal that appears before the head of the household is going to die, and so on. And this is exactly the symbol that Conan Doyle draws on, obviously, with the Hound of the Baskervilles. So the difference there being, whereas it's very common in folklore for an animal to appear as a portent of what's going to happen. It doesn't actually cause what's going to happen. It's just a precursor. It's a warning about something. Whereas then you move into this kind of more fictionalized territory of the Hound of the Baskervilles, and the Hound is the one that causes the death by chasing down the head of the household, and that doesn't happen in folklore. Ghosts in folklore are rarely responsible for death. They appear as a precursor to it, but they don't cause it. That's not how the folklore works. So yeah, you do find these kinds of portentous versions, the same as you do with other animals. But again, they are very closely linked to the symbolism of the dog. So again, the shuck varieties in the north, they have that kind of portentous quality about them far more than the ones that we find down here in the southwest, which don't tend to have that angle quite so strongly.
It's interesting. I'm certainly thinking of it. It might feel like a tangent, but there does seem to be a correlation with. It's made me think of up the road from me is an estate called Pulin. It's the seat of the Kendall family, and this story is of a sort of death coach that's said to approach at the house. And I wonder if you get similar. They serve a sort of similar purpose before there's to be a death in the family. This phantom coach appears. Is it kind of a similar thing that before a death, the ghost dog is said to appear at the house or something along those lines? Is it sort of serving a similar thing?
Yes, it is. In those cases where the dog is associated with a family, then it will often be in that same way. Yeah, these stories usually grow up around this kind of omen of something that is to come. Yeah.
And from looking at cases in sort of say Devon and Cornwall and the southwest, are there ones that you kind of go, that's quite unique, or do they tend to sort of fit into a type that you find elsewhere in Britain as well?
They tend to follow the same patterns. You'll always find odd stories that have kind of unique qualities about them, and I think you'll find that everywhere. But you do tend to have similar representations. I mean, there are one or two interesting examples, I guess, in this part of the world. I mean, the Black Dog of Torrington is a really good example of that, because it's been plotted to sort of transition such a long route that it takes. So starting down in Morchard Bishop, and it's kind of mid-Devon area, close to where I live actually, and then going right up through to Torrington. This was plotted by Barbara Carbonell in the 1960s, I want to say off the top of my head. And she'd learned about it from her gardener, whose father had seen the dog. He was a carrier, or a courier, as we would now call it, I guess. And he used to obviously travel the roads at night. And he had one or two sightings of it. And she got interested in this story and plotted the route of this dog from the sightings that were reported. And what's really interesting about that one is that we can see where it follows roads that exist now, but also ancient roads or ancient trackways that we know are there, but we don't use now for traveling on. And there's a very distinct kind of pattern of sightings of that animal that follows these roads. And I think it's people say, well, it's curious that we get all of these sightings on roads and pathways like this, but I guess it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you were a dog and you were out at night, whether you're a real one or a spectral one, why go across a muddy field when you can go up a nice path?
Definitely. And I'm really intrigued by this idea of the sort of continuing routes that are sort of less well known now as well, because that sort of tends to take it back to an earlier date and time. Has any kind of have any theories been put forward to explain this sort of the origin or the reason for these particular routes for the Black Dog of Torrington, or is it a little bit hazy?
No, I don't think there's any kind of real theory for it as such. It just seems to be a route that has been particularly well plotted and suggests that it is the same animal. And I mean, folklore grows around these sorts of stories, doesn't it? I mean, if you stop and analyze it, why is it the same animal? How do we know that it's the same animal? It's just a route that has been plotted. You know, that you can, depending on your belief system, you can argue that the ley lines that have been plotted across the country follow particular paths. But then if you're not a believer in those sorts of things, you can say, well, you know, they're different experiences that have been plotted to make a straight line, and you read meaning into it later. The beauty of folklore is that we don't care whether something is real or truthful necessarily. That's not how folklore operates. We're interested in the experiential side of it, and why these stories hang around, why they change and shape and develop and travel in the ways that they do. So the fact that the Black Dog of Torrington is plotted to follow this particular route, you know, may or may not be down to one particular animal traveling that route. We'll never know, but it's a good story.
Absolutely, yeah. And for me, it's always the stories are the starting point and what draw
Yeah.
you. And what's I'm already thinking of is a comparison with a story in Lincolnhorn in East Cornwall around this
Yeah.
dog simply called Carrier. And
Mm.
it follows this same sort of type of you've got this very specific route, but a sort of range of different, potential backstories that have been put forward. So once accompanied a carrier or courier, or
Yeah.
said to be, someone who was killed in an accident at a mine. But that one seems to have been quite a big one in the papers. I think partly because of William H. Painter getting involved
Yes. Yes.
with investigations and things like that.
Yeah, that is an interesting example because it's a much older story that then re-emerges. And I think the 1930s, that story comes back to public light. And yeah, William Painter, I think, has a lot to do with that. But it goes into the newspapers slightly before Painter starts talking about it. But it certainly seems to be something to do with these earlier stories that came before. And then, of course, once it gets reported in the newspapers, then other people start to kind of say, oh, yeah, I heard that story when I was a child and it was like this, or actually, no, it was there. And the reason that it appeared is because of X, Y, and Z. And then you get these different versions come to light. It then kind of enters public consciousness, I guess, and people start to write poetry about it, and all sorts of things happen. It's got, I think, when it was reported in the 1930s, it was a lot more vague than we actually know about now. So we know that it was related to the kind of Lincolnhorn area, but then the route was plotted later on. So yeah, Mark Valley Mine it's connected with, and through Lincolnhorn, and then a bit further on, and I think it terminates at Stoke Climsland. So it's a really interesting story, and then it has another element that I came across later on with it. So there was a poem written about the Black Dog of Lincolnhorn, and it was written by a lady called Mary Hellier, and I think it was published in the press or somewhere at this time. But why I found that interesting is that there's a kind of a fetch or a banshee or whatever you want to call it, this kind of portentous family ghost in Cornwall that is said to be connected to a particular family, which originally was a family called the Peters family, but then later on became connected to a family called the Hellier family. And I wonder whether there's a connection between the Hellier family and the Mary Hellier who wrote this poem about the Lincolnhorn black dog. So it's another one of those really kind of vague connections that you get in folklore that you can never quite prove one way or the other, but it would be really nice if there was something there.
I'm really fascinated with this dog around Lincolnhorn that's often referred to as Carrier. Back in February of 1937, an article appeared in the Daily Mirror which read, "3 more see ghost dog." 3 more people today told me that they had seen the ghost dog of Lincolnhorn, Cornwall. The story of which appeared in the Daily Mirror yesterday. They are witnesses who can vouch for the accuracy of what they have seen. One is Mr. Stanley Spink, baker's roundsman of Commercial Road, Gunnislake. He told me that he and his father saw the ghost dog while on their rounds last Tuesday. As we were coming up Bangor's Hill, he said, we saw what appeared to be a big black dog with a long tail, travelling swiftly ahead of us. The dog went along the side of a 12-foot hedge, then it disappeared, as if into space. The sightings became something of a sensation in the newspapers across the UK at that time, and William H. Painter, a writer from Callington, who I've mentioned on the podcast because of his research into Cornish witchcraft, is called in at the time to sort of investigate. The Western Morning News for the 20th of February 1937 writes, "For 3 hours last night, Mr. W. H. Painter of Callington, the Cornish bard, who is well known for his investigation of the supernatural in Cornwall, had, on behalf of the Western Morning News, been investigating the alleged reappearance of the ghost dog said to haunt a stretch of road at Lincolnhorn. Despite the investigation, it seems that nothing was seen or heard of the phantom dog that night, but plenty of locals claimed to have witnessed it. The article mentions a Mr. F. Favier, a chemist and druggist, who had recently seen the dog whilst riding his bike. Mr. Joseph Mitchell and a Mrs. Hocking, along with a Mr. Thomas Harris of Plusher Bridge, also said they'd seen it. Cornwall-based writer Barbara Spooner talks of how the ghost dog was associated with the nearby Mark Valley mine. She writes, "A man was supposedly killed in the mine, and his name was remembered until recently. The dog ghost is described as big as a yearling, with eyes as teacups, flaming. The route is from Mark Valley Mine through Rilla Mill, up cellars and past 2 gates in Lincolnhorn to Stoke Climsland. And at 2 gates he was seen by a woman and man driving home in the dark 100 or more years ago. As they approached, it leapt over a way soil heap and vanished from sight." I looked into this potential origin story for the ghost dog, thought to be the spirit of this man who had worked at Mark Valley Mine. And I came across an article in the Royal Cornwall Gazette from June of 1860, which details a coroner's inquest on the body of a young man of 17 named William Smith. And I quote, "The deceased worked at Mark Valley Mine in Lincolnhorn, and on the day previous he went down to the 116 fathom level with his comrade for the purpose of blasting some hard ground. Deceased had bored a hole in the rock and filled it with powder, which exploded without breaking the rock. Deceased and comrade again filled the same hole with powder, and whilst both men were tamping, the hole exploded and the force of the powder struck deceased in the face and head and instantly killed him. Verdict: accidental death." So this is one story from the mine. I have found another dating from 3 years earlier, around 1857. In the Penzance Gazette, we're told that a man by the name of Daw, and I quote, had his leg broken and received other severe injuries from the falling in of a piece of ground on him. Apparently he was taken home where a surgeon named Mr. Prideaux performed an amputation of the leg, but it seems that Daw succumbed to his wounds within 4 hours of the operation. So, a couple of possible incidents at the mine that might have provided fuel for the local folklore. Some say that the dog is called Carrier because he accompanied a carrier every Saturday along the road. He is supposed to be repeating the journey the same amount of times as he did whilst alive. In one place there's said to be a rattling of chains, and the dog appears as big as a yearling. In other places, he's said to be headless.
When these stories do start to become talked about in, say, the 1930s in this instance, I love finding the little stories that come out of the woodwork, where you find all the little nuggets of, oh no, I was told this as a young lad, I was told that,
Yeah.
because these are the sort of things that as a geek I'm trying to find, are the little local ones that the stories you would hear in a local pub normally,
Yeah.
that start to come out, and finding those can be really tricky. So it can actually be great when you get something like Lincoln Horn in this instance bubbles up in the press. That can actually have a really positive aspect in the sense of you get these little stories coming out of the woodwork.
Yes, absolutely, because people start to say, I heard that as a child, but it wasn't like that, it was like this. And you find that some of these stories then tend to draw on stories that come from other areas in folklore that people may or may not be aware of. So there's a story about a black dog that's connected to a family called the Haines family around the Crediton area. But the story is connected to how there's some wager involving riding a horse between one place and another place in a particular period of time, and this black dog causes the horse to rear up and the rider falls and breaks his neck. But that's very common. You find that story in 4 or 5 other places across the UK connected to a black dog and a wager and having to ride in a way that you should not ride a horse ultimately at the end of the day. So, it's a cautionary tale. The same as a lot of folklore is cautionary. But yeah, those sorts of stories crop up then, and they draw elements from other stories as well. That's all part of the fascination of the subject.
Definitely. And this is why I'm always fascinated going. I encounter a story in Cornwall, and I go, hang on, I read about a case of that in mid Devon or South Devon.
Yeah.
There's little elements here, and you go, I wonder how these, you can only speculate at how these storytelling traditions kind of move, and how they move. But I'm also already thinking about a place that when you look on the map in Devon, you've literally got a place called Black Dog.
Yes.
And so obviously that probably cropped up in the course of your research, and I seem to remember you mentioning it in the book. But if I remember rightly, and I can't remember if I'm imagining this or not, is there something to do with the pub, the Black Dog, but also mention of a tunnel nearby and a sort of
Yeah.
guardian dog?
Yeah, it's a real kind of mess of folklore, that one. So yes, the village is called Black Dog, and there is an earthworks there which has this story of a black dog associated with it as a guardian. A number of black dogs in Devon and Cornwall are said to be guardians of something, guardians of a treasure, or guardians of a tunnel or earthworks or something like that. And that's the case in Black Dog Village. And then the pub is nearby. And the pub was called, it's not a pub anymore, it's a private house now, but it was called the Black Dog Inn. So everybody assumes that that name comes from this story of the black dog being a guardian spirit. But of course, we know that pub names are never as obvious, the same as place names in folklore are never as obvious as you think they're going to be. And the Black Dog Inn used to be called the Blue Boy, and it was renamed the Black Dog by a prior landlord after his dog. He had a particular favourite hunting dog, which was black, and he renamed the pub the Black Dog Inn to remember his pet dog or his hunting dog. Had nothing at all to do with the nearby folklore at all. But of course, the two then become conflated, and then the name of the village comes into the mix as well. And yet, you find that sort of thing a lot. The same as you do with place names in the landscape that people assume are connected to one thing and probably aren't.
I love finding those things anyway, because I find that an interesting folklore in itself, how stories become attributed to how, the etymology of certain things. Am I right in thinking that there's a connection to something, the sort of Civil War period, in terms of this tunnel and the earthworks and the alleged black dog?
Yes, I think I don't remember the details of it off the top of my head, but that seems to be right as far as I can recall, because you find the Civil War associated with a lot of this sort of folklore. So there's a story from Uplyme of a black dog that leads somebody to an area of a cottage where they break a hole in the ceiling and find a hidden cache of coins. And of course, it's Civil War coins that they find as well. So there seems to be a lot of connections within folklore to the Civil War, because folklore originates, not from detailed recorded history and things like that. The folklore originates from the people. And of course, the Civil War is from within the people. It's from within the same area or the same country. So you find, I guess, that there's a lot of association because of that.
And sort of with the sort of 17th century stuck in my head, I guess it can't avoid talking or mentioning the whole Lady Howard thing, because
Yes.
and that's a whole, podcast, if not podcast series in itself, because it's such a big topic. But we get in some versions of the sort of Lady Howard legends, we get the mention of a ghostly dog or perhaps a black dog that is kind of involved in this sort of Sisyphean task.
Yes.
I'm always intrigued about how that sort of thing develops and how the dog gets incorporated in those kinds of stories as well.
Well, I mean, often it is just a conflation of different aspects of folklore that get naturally pulled together over time because they're from a particular area, and in the same way as stories, pull threads from other stories where it suits. And in the case of Lady Howard, then there are a couple of variations. Lady Howard's story is fascinating, and it does warrant a serious unpicking, which has been going on at the moment because my wife's giving a talk on Lady Howard at Hell Tour Festival next month, to kind of look at the history behind that story. There's been a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about Lady Howard. She had a bad rep where she didn't deserve a bad rep, because it was her father that deserves all of the bad rep that you can get, not her. But of course, folklore doesn't work like that. So she becomes this penitential ghost with this carriage made out of the bones of her, or with the skulls of her 4 dead husbands on the corners, depending on the version. And she has to drive from Fitzford House in Tavistock, where the family seat was, to Oakhampton Castle every night and pluck 1 blade of grass from the castle mound and return home. And she must do this until the castle mound has been cleared of grass. So, a normal kind of folklore story about binding a spirit for all time to an impossible task as retribution for what they did in life. And yes, there's a couple of different versions. So in some versions of the story, she is accompanied by a black dog, described as being like a black greyhound that runs alongside the carriage. But in other versions of the story, she transforms into a black dog and runs herself. None of this makes any sense, of course, compared to the original story, because these things rarely do. Yes, a dog running alongside a carriage makes perfect sense because carriage dogs were a thing. But then the idea of transforming into a black dog having kind of evil connotations by the colour and by the nature of hellhounds, even though there's no connection there, it makes perfect sense for a folkloric character who is seen to have lived a bad life, even though she didn't, to transform into a beast in that way. So I can see where these sort of aspects get drawn into the story, but you're absolutely right. You could do, and it would make a very good whole episode on Lady Howard, because there's a lot of material there to look at.
And so is this a kind of thing that you tend to encounter where you get someone who is described as quote unquote wicked, that they become or are represented by a sort of a ghost dog or black dog, spectral hound, however you want to call it?
You can certainly see that, yes, and that's the whole kind of premise behind some stories, is that this kind of evil representation. So Hergest Ridge in Herefordshire has this kind of connection to I mean, not necessarily that the person is always represented by the black dog, but that the black dog is connected to an evil person in some way. Squire Cable's tomb at Buckfastleigh Old Church is a prime example of that. So Richard Cable, potentially one of the inspirations, again, behind Hound of the Baskervilles, but possibly not. He has this reputation as being an evil squire and the kind of scourge of the parish and so on. So we find that we have a couple of versions again of his story that have these elements to them where he's either chased across the moor by black dogs or that black dogs come and bay for his soul at the window of his bedchamber as he's dying and so on. And then this all gets added to by the fact that his tomb is so unusual. So he's buried in this vaulted tomb, said to have a stone placed over the body, and then a stone sarcophagus built over the top of that. That much, at least, is pretty much true. And then this whole kind of brick tomb with the iron bars, a grill on one side, and a locked oak door on the other side, all said to be to stop his spirit from rising because he was so evil. And then you get stories, sort of playground stories about circling the tomb a number of times and putting your finger through the keyhole of the door and having Squire Cable gnaw on the end of your finger and so on. A bit like Lady Howard, a story that has developed and become embedded, which needs clarification because there have been 4 or 5 people called Richard Cable within that family. And the person who has all of this attributed to them is not the person that's buried in the tomb at all. It's a different member of the same family that did a lot of the things which are now attributed to the person who lies in that tomb. So again, there's a whole conflation of history and a conflation of folklore behind it. But the story develops and the story becomes embedded, and much like the press running a story which has little evidence behind it and everybody believing it, that's how folklore works too.
Hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, then don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. Maybe consider leaving a review, which can help other people to discover the series and also helps this project to grow. If you'd like to help support the series further, then please consider checking out my Patreon page at patreon.com/The Pisky Trap. This project is completely independent and it's funded by myself, along with the help of listener support. From as little as £1 a month, pledges on Patreon help me to cover the running costs and purchase books, materials, and gain access to historical archives as part of the research for each episode. So if you can help by offering a monthly pledge on Patreon, that'd be amazing. If not, no worries. Just continuing to spread the word among friends and on social media is also a real help. Okay then, that's enough of that. Let's get back to the episode.
In the last episode, I was chatting with Elizabeth Dale, who's a blogger who goes by the name of The Cornish Bird, and we were talking about her book, Buried at the Crossroads. And I wondered if there's ever a crossover with crossroads and gallows sites and sort of black dogs and spectral hounds as well.
Yeah, you do find them sometimes associated, which is no great surprise, but there isn't always an obvious reason for it. So it's one of those aspects of folklore, I think, that just it's such a strong image, it's such a strong motif in people's minds that it's an obvious element that gets placed within stories. So yes, a black dog haunting a gallows site would not be unusual. And again, gallows sites and crossroads, they're these strange kind of boundary places as well, which is often where you find stories of ghosts such as this. The black dog exists in some aspects of folklore as a psychopomp, so as a purveyor of souls to the underworld or whatever. So you get a lot of examples of black dogs that disappear in boundary conditions. So they might sink into the ground or disappear into a body of water or through a hedge or something like that, which kind of ties in with this element. Crossroads and gallows sites, which were often on crossroads as well. Yeah, it's an example that's not unsurprising that you would find them there.
And I have to wonder if sometimes, this is just me speculating, whether things like this, that the black dog is kind of like a folk remembrance of certain events tied to certain places. Like, that's a site we don't go at night. That's a remembrance of an event, a tragedy at a mine. And sometimes you get stories of black dogs and things. Is it a kind of storytelling tradition around basically a folk remembrance of events that get passed down and that kind of thing, perhaps?
Yeah, it's quite plausible, I think. Yeah. I see no reason why not. As an image, I think, depending on your view and whether you hold any truck with the idea of folk memory generally, the black dog is a really strong image for that, because it's the kind of earliest domesticated animal. It's been tied to us as a species so closely for so long that if you follow those kinds of ideas of archetypes and folk memory and the kind of ideas that Jung explored in his psychology, then it makes perfect sense when you look at a lot of the folklore that's what's going on. So these whole ideas where people are using the same descriptive terms, the same stories, even if they profess, and probably don't, have any knowledge of the folklore beforehand, ties into this idea of the subconscious folk memory of an archetype of something like a black dog. So yeah, that whole idea, I think, sort of sits alongside that very well.
And there's one case that I couldn't not bring up because it's from the town where I grew up and is like 2 minutes down the road from where I am now. And this is in St. Blasey, and a chap called Samuel Drew, back in, I think, about 1780, where he describes being at near Tregrain, I think, which is literally down the road as well on the Carline estate, I think, at the time. But he gives this description of when he's out poaching one night.
Samuel Drew's account is relayed in Paul White's Classic Cornish Ghost Stories, and it reads as follows. There were several of us, boys and men, out about 12 o'clock on a bright moonlit night. I think we were poaching. The party were in a field adjoining the road leading from my master's to St. Austell, and I was stationed outside the hedge to watch and give the alarm if any intruder should appear. While thus occupied, I heard what appeared to be the sound of a horse approaching from the town, and I gave signal. My companions paused and came to the hedge where I was to see the passenger, meaning the passer-by. They looked through the bushes, and I drew myself close to the hedge that I might not be observed. The sound increased, and the supposed horseman seemed drawing near. The clatter of the hooves became more and more distinct. We all looked to see who and what it was, and I was seized with a strange, indefinable feeling of dread, when, instead of a horse, there appeared, coming towards us, at an easy pace, but with the same sound that first caught my ear, a creature about the height of a large dog. It went close by me, and as it passed, it turned upon me and my companions huge fiery eyes that struck terror to all our hearts. The road where I stood branched off in two directions, in one of which there was a gate across. Towards the gate it moved, and without any apparent obstruction went on at its regular trot, which we heard several minutes after it had disappeared. Whatever it was, it put an end to our occupation, and we made the best of our way home. Writing down this account, Drew goes on to reflect. The creature was unlike any animal I had then seen, but from my present recollections, it had much the appearance of a bear, with a dark, shaggy coat. Had it not been for the unearthly lustre of its eyes, and its passing through the gate as it did, there would be no reason to suppose it anything more than an animal escaped perhaps from some menagerie. That it did pass through the gate, without pause or hesitation, I am perfectly clear.
But from what I remember, he describes it being like an oversized, big, shaggy black dog. But it fits the description you often get, that it's, as big as a yearling or as big as a calf or whatever. But then the main thing that stands out in my memory is that it has glowing eyes, I think, but then passes through a gate. And that's the moment where he goes, there was something unnatural, because you have something in the landscape and they go, oh, okay, it's not actually physical, if you like, it's spiritual in some way. Is that a kind of common encounter that we sort of find in accounts and descriptions?
Yeah, absolutely, because that has all of the kind of key elements to it that we're referring to here. Yeah, so you have descriptive elements there which draw from this idea of some kind of subconscious or folk memory of a symbol or of an image where people are using the same terms. So as big as a yearling, as big as a calf, as big as a donkey, these are all really common descriptors across time. We still get them in modern versions today. Of course, culturally, we draw on different things. We're not so tied to the land and agriculture as we used to be in some areas. So modern sightings, people might say, as big as a wolf, because this is particularly from other countries as well, because there's this whole aspect of kind of what you're used to visualizing. So yeah, you've got that element, and again, the glowing eyes, the eyes as big as saucers or fiery eyes, all of this goes into it as well. And that whole idea of passing through a gate. So there's the moment at which you realize that, yes, you thought there was something unusual, but you couldn't put your finger on it. But the gate was closed and it passed right through it. But again, that's a boundary state, passing through from one side to the other, which is a key element of these things as well. There are quite a few examples of dogs that pass through gates or disappear where there's a gate, and when people go there, the gate is shut and there was no way that the dog could have gone through it. There's one near me between Lapford and Crediton, which was reported by Trevor Beer, the naturalist, in the Western Morning News years ago, as being exactly that. They went to investigate the site and discovered there was a gate there, which is, the gate is not open at this time. So yeah, you've got lots and lots of really common elements in that story. And then you have to question why they're there. What is the purpose of that story? Is that a story to warn people not to go out poaching? Is it a story to warn people about not being in a particular area at night? Those are really common, particularly for coastal dogs, because they draw on smugglers' stories. And where that becomes interesting then is where you have to try and work out which came first, the dog or the smuggler's story, because smugglers would draw on folklore and then use those stories to keep people away from where they were working. Or they would invent stories completely, but then those stories become embedded in the folklore that we have now. And sometimes it's really difficult to kind of pull those things apart. So there's all sorts of really common elements to that St. Blaise story. And whether we can ever be certain what's behind it is really hard to say now. Is that an event that actually happened? Or is it a story that comes out of folklore for a particular purpose? And if it is, what is the purpose behind the story?
Absolutely. And I'm instantly thinking, one, he admits that he was out poaching.
Yeah.
Two, there are some people have speculated that when he was a young man, he may have been involved in smuggling in the area. So yeah, there's certainly some elements in there that you kind of brought up that you go, makes you think, do some of the elements come into play there?
Yeah.
Something I was going to ask is, should we think of wild hunt related stories as something different? Does that kind of start to move into a whole different category as opposed to black dogs and spectral hounds, or is there quite a blurring of the lines?
There is a blurring of the lines. In fact, there's an episode of my podcast really early on in like season 1 or season 2 that looks at this whole aspect of black dogs and the wild hunt. And there are some crossovers, but I think for the most part they are more distinctive than they are blurred. So there's a lot of kind of aspects of the stories of the wild hunt which come down from Germanic mythology, for example, and make their way across. But the whole aspect of demon dogs we find in all sorts of different areas of both mythology and folklore. So there's crossover there between the two. And then the stories of the wild hunt become embedded in the more local folkloric tales. So the wild hunt is really strongly associated with Dartmoor, really strongly associated with wilder areas of Cornwall as well. And then you get the regional variation that we were talking about earlier on, which gets mapped onto that too. Who's leading the wild hunt? Well, sometimes it's the devil, which comes from the kind of influence of Christianity on folklore. Sometimes it's Odin, and that comes down from the Teutonic mythology aspect. Sometimes it's Sir Francis Drake, and then that comes from the regional version of this. And there are all sorts of different ways that these things become blurred. So they start off as being more distinct, but then over time, the edges become blurred, like they always do with this sort of material.
Definitely. And I'm already reminded of I think it's Sabine Berengold. I never know if I'm saying his name right.
Sabin.
Sabine Berengold.
According to the family, it was pronounced Sabin.
Sabine Berengold. I'm going to correct that now. But I remember him recounting a ballad. I think it's around a character called Oscar of Tetcut Manor on the Tamar. And again, it's another example of we've got an individual that again you don't know which member of the Ascot family it was, who's this sort of is it Wicked Ascot or something like that? The name is attached to, who's been inserted. And it follows the same sort of storyline as you get around Francis Drake or Dando and his dogs in the other part of sort of southeast Cornwall. So I find it really fascinating. We start to go, why have they been inserted into they've been selected to kind of fit into this story tradition, if you like.
Yeah. Sometimes there are good reasons for it. If there's a local character who was particularly villainous often, or sometimes particularly good. Francis Drake wasn't particularly villainous, but he was very strongly associated with the area for historical reasons that we now all know. Then they can become attached to stories in that way. The idea of somebody having special abilities or being particularly meaningful can come across in different ways. So with somebody like Francis Drake, you would have it obviously as an important character. And then you get it in kind of supernatural aspects with people in a community who have special skills that other people don't, which is why we see blacksmiths and weavers and all of these sorts of characters coming up time and again in folklore, in ghost stories and things like that, because they're other in some way, and the othering aspect of communities or characters is really important in folklore for various reasons. I mean, you know that from your witchcraft research, the whole kind of othering of people being so important. So that's why these stories kind of generate in the way that they do, and why people get attributed to them in the way that they do.
And I think it's sort of this idea again, it sort of it keeps coming up of sort of dogs sometimes embodying certain characters. And I seem to remember you mentioning in the book cases in Cornwall of dogs, their sort of features taking on the resemblance or the faces even of wicked men, sort of,
Yes.
people who passed away. And I found that a really unusual one I'd not encountered before. Because I suppose in my head, I'm literally imagining, like a dog's body with a person's head. I don't know if it's as literal as that, but I hadn't come across anything like that before.
No, and it makes little sense when you think about it. And then it makes even less sense when you get ideas of, there are some stories where the dog is said to have a human head,
Mm.
But as a concession to how horrific that would be, the head is invisible. And that's why you get headless dog stories. And then you go back and think, well, how do you know that the head looked like a particular person if it's invisible? Was it once visible and then these things never make any sense, but they make good stories. There are a few examples of dogs with human features, but folklorically there's little sense behind most of them, I think.
Are a majority of the stories, the dogs that appear in them, are they generally described as being black, or do we get sort of different colours and variations as well?
We do get different colours and variations, but they are predominantly black. And that's why the term black dog has become associated with spectral dogs as a kind of en masse description. So you do find some red dogs, you find white dogs in particular parts of the country, white dogs as a supernatural aspect. Again, connected more with sometimes mythology or sometimes fairy beliefs and fairy dogs. There are a couple of examples of yellow dogs, and then in different parts of the world, they might be very specific to different areas. So spectral dogs in Texas are often white rather than black, for example. But people use black dogs because the terminology has become embedded and is more straightforward. More accurately, spectral dogs would be the right description to use, but you'll never change it now. It'll
No.
always be black dogs.
No, it's so embedded by this point.
Yeah. And that's because the majority of them are black. But why? Why are they black? Well, it's easy from the point of view of the shuck or the bar guest or the hellhound portentous aspect for you, because the black aspect of an animal or a ghost is naturally demonic and ties into the devil, and descriptions of the devil in terms of folklore, or the black man as he's sometimes described in terms of witchcraft cases and things like that. But in terms of protective dogs or neutral dogs, there's no reason for them to necessarily be black. It kind of comes across from the other side of the more portentous versions. They just are. They're black. In most stories, they are black.
Do you have a particular favourite story, or one that you always come back to and you go, that one will always be my sort of go-to story when I think of this subject, or one that is always or continues to fascinate you?
I think I find more often than not the whole kind of aspect of description and repetition of description to be more of interest than a specific case. So these whole ideas of finding these descriptions where people are using the same terms over time, perhaps with cultural shift, or perhaps with shift in terms of time and place and things like that. But I find that far more fascinating than the individual. There are some good cases. There are lots of cases where people are protected from being robbed on country roads by black dogs, and ones where there's a nice one, and I forget off the top of my head where it comes from, where somebody is so terrified by a black dog that their hair turns white overnight. Again, it's a common, if not medically problematic aspect of a folkloric story, but we have a few examples of it. It's been attributed to other things as well. Survivors of the Titanic, I think there was a survivor or two of the Titanic to which that was also attributed. So there are little individual stories and pockets of things like that which are kind of fun, but it's the broader approach to it, and this repetition of terminology and of stories cropping up in different places that are very, very similar with no obvious reason why they should be. That's the kind of thing that interests me most.
And do you think that sightings and accounts of black dogs and spectral hounds is something we see more historically, or is it something that you think is still being reported or has been in recent years?
They are still reported, and people still occasionally send me stories because I still collect stories to add to the archives that I look after. There's There's a 1,000+ examples in that archive, but people still send me stuff from time to time. So you do get modern ones. What doesn't happen so much these days is they don't get reported anywhere anymore. They're personal stories to people more now. You would perhaps get them in the press like you did with the Lincolnhorn example, those sorts of things. You don't tend to get that anymore. People don't write to the papers with these sorts of stories. They're more personal, but they do still come up. And sometimes people send stories that happened to them 10, 20, 30 years ago. And sometimes people will tell you stories that happened recently. So they're not as widespread as they used to be, but they do still come up.
And so then is it kind of tying into that? Do you think it's one of those subjects that you'll always be pulled back to and that you intend to kind of always keep researching and be doing a bit on the side in the hope of finding more hidden gems of accounts and stories and things like that?
Yeah, I don't think it's a story. I don't think it's a subject that's ever going to leave what I'm doing, to be honest. I mean, this was the first book I wrote. So this book came out in 2015. I've written a number of books and done a lot of research and a lot of work since then. But a lot of people still know me for that book as much as they do it's the other 10 years of work and podcasting and writing and research that I've done. And I think that's quite telling in and of itself. I think it's quite telling because this was the first book that really examined the subject in a kind of full and complete way, in the way that it does. There had been other books that didn't like Explore Black Dogs from Heart of Albion, and there'd been examples as part of other books where different authors had written different chapters. But this was the first book that was really a full-length study by one person, and really still is in a lot of ways. So I think probably for that reason, people associate me with it, and probably always will. But also, I think it's testament to the fact that Black Dog and the dog itself is such an embedded part of our personal subconscious or our personal culture, folklorically and otherwise. It's just one of those things that seems to resonate with people, and I'm going off as we record this in the next week or so to give a talk in Portsmouth on the subject, 10 years down the line from when I originally did it, and I still give talks on it now. And I vary the things that I talk about from time to time, but people still want me to talk about this subject so long after the book came out, and I think that's just testament to the importance of the material to us culturally and folklorically.
That was my chat with Mark Norman exploring Black Dog folklore. A huge thank you to Mark for taking the time to chat. If you haven't read it already, I highly recommend checking out his book, Black Dog Folklore, which I've popped a link to in the show notes, and the new book, Devon's Forgotten Witches, 1860 to 1910, co-authored with Tracy Norman, is out now, and you can also find a link to that below. That's it from me. I hope you found this episode interesting. As always, feel free to get in touch. You can email me at thepiskytrap@gmail.com. We'll be back again very soon to explore a different local topic. In the meantime, take care and thanks for listening. The Pisky Trap is presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Karis Harrington.